Please welcome back Melanie.
In 1985, when my parents were divorced and my mom was working at Mervyn's, Grandma and Grandpa spent a lot of time looking after me, age 6, and my little brother, Steve, age 4. We spent a lot of time at their triplex apartment in Oxnard, where a basket of flowers hung from a front porch rafter and cigarette smoke always hung in the air. The flowers were called 4 o'clocks because they opened at 4 o'clock every day. Grandpa was a wounded World War II vet with shrapnel in his leg, so he spent most of his time lying on the sofa, which Grandma called a Davenport, with one of the crocheted blankets she called an Afghan draped across his lower body. We would watch Alfred Hitchcock Presents and drink apple juice from jelly jars, except Grandpa's apple juice came from a bottle on top of the fridge, labeled Jim Beam. Since Mom worked such unpredictable retail hours and Dad was nowhere to be found, sometimes Grandma and Grandpa would have to shuttle us around Ventura County, through agricultural back roads, past strawberry fields, and onto rainy highways that rounded the coastline. From Oxnard, they would drive us to the condo Mom rented on Ventura's north side, where me and my little brother Steve shared a bedroom. It was always Grandpa driving, because Grandma didn't. Grandma could cook, garden, crochet, but she was the only grown-up I knew who didn't have a driver's license. So Grandpa was our default chauffeur in his brick red hatchback 1974 Ford Pinto. There isn't much I remember about being 6 in 1985, but I remember what it felt like being in the back seat of that Pinto. It was too loud. It rattled. And it smelled like stale cigarette smoke, gasoline fumes, and disintegrating vinyl. One time we were riding in the backseat of Grandpa's Pinto and a song came on the radio that he loved, Willie Nelson, On the Road Again. There didn't seem to be much that made my grandpa happy, so it was nice to see him smiling at the song. He turned it up so we could hear it over the racket of the Pinto's rattling, and we all started to sing along. On the road again, I just can't wait to get on the road again. Life I love is making music with my friends. And at this point, from the back seat, my little hand reached out to rest on Grandma's shoulder in a gesture of sympathy like I'd seen people at church do. It's okay, Grandma, you don't have to sing. Because Grandma could cook, she could crochet, she could sew, she could grow a salad garden from nothing and make a dollar stretch all week, but singing was not one of her talents. Grandpa laughed so hard he nearly drove off the road, and I realized I'd made a mistake. I thought I was being nice, but I had just insulted my dear sweet Grandma, who never showed me anything but endless patience and loving kindness. But since Grandpa got such a kick out of it, "That's okay, Grandma, you don't have to sing," became the punchline to a story he loved telling again and again, for as long as he lived, which wasn't much longer after that. He passed away in 1986 at the age of 59, which I understand now was far too young. But at the time, I didn't understand. I didn't understand anything that was happening after that, about how the shock of grief shook my dad out of his weird, estranged, living in a broken-down houseboat era and right back into our family life. And I didn't understand how Grandpa died, because all the grown-ups would say was, "We weren't expecting it. He got sick so suddenly." A little white lie, a secret they would keep until I was old enough to handle it. But in the aftermath, there was no time to dwell on Grandpa's passing. In a moment, I was yanked out of my second grade class at Pierpont Elementary next door to the Pacific Ocean and got to be the new kid in class at Skyline, right next to the Mojave Desert. On the plus side, my mom and dad got married again. But the downside to the happy reunion was that our fresh beginning as a whole family unit came with a move 3.5 hours away to Southern California's other side, Barstow. And as our nuclear family of Mom, Dad, me, and Steve tried to pick up where we left off before the divorce in a new town and a new house where I had my own bedroom, Grandma went to stay with my Uncle Tim, Dad's little brother, where he was stationed in Arkansas. Then it wasn't long before she moved back to California, specifically into the extra room at our house in Barstow. There were lots of reasons I should not have wanted to hang out in Grandma's room when I was a little kid. I was asthmatic and allergic to cats, and Grandma spent most of the time in her room with her Russian blue, Smokey, in her lap, reading paperback murder mysteries, drinking Diet Coke, and smoking Kent 3 100 ultralights with the window open. Still, I parked myself in there beside her all the time, reading my own trashy paperbacks, mostly Sweet Valley Twins. No one else in my family was much of a reader, so Grandma was my bookworm buddy. And I got bronchitis every winter. Thank you, secondhand smoke. By the time I got to junior high, Grandma wanted her own place and moved into a little 2-bedroom house a few miles away. My breathing improved significantly, though some weekends, me and Steve would stay at Grandma's so our parents could have some alone time. On Friday nights, we set up our sleeping bags in the extra room, which had a radio, and listened to Casey Kasem's Top 40. Yes, we would have competitions. Whose song is going to make it to number 1 this week? He liked Belle Biv DeVoe and Criss Cross, and I liked Paula Abdul and Wilson Phillips. I don't think either one of us won that week. But it was fun listening to Casey's Top 40. And that was the only thing that was fun about being at Grandma's house. As a tween, everything else about being there was boring. It was in a sketchy part of town, so we couldn't really play outside. The TV always seemed to be playing Wheel of Fortune. I could not stand the flavor of Diet Coke, and I think Smokey resented me. Then as I got older, I started to find Grandma embarrassing. She had grown up poor in rural Ohio, an only child. She left school after 8th grade when her father died. I didn't understand how a life so shaped by poverty and grief might look a little different than I was used to. I just knew that it was embarrassing to be seen in public with a fat, toothless woman who refused to wear dentures just as willfully as she refused to drive, said weird words like icebox instead of refrigerator and Davenport, and prized comfort over style, always wearing shapeless house dresses and ugly slip-on canvas shoes. I was an ambitious kid with career aspirations to get out of Barstow, see the world, and be somebody. When I was little, Grandma had so much to teach me. How to measure flour when you're baking a cake, how to grow flowers or vegetables from a seed, how to give a great big hug that radiates warmth and love. But as I got to be high school aged at the start of the 90s, it felt like she had nothing left to teach me. So when she announced she'd had enough of Barstow's brutal desert summers and was moving to Washington State, I was sad, but not that sad. I had school and track practice and drama club. I had youth group at St. Joseph's and my friends and the boys we had crushes on, and Sweet Valley High novels, of course. Not a lot of time left over for being bored at Grandma's. Her move to Lacey, Washington, just outside Olympia, was a huge upgrade for Grandma. She rented one side of a duplex just a few miles down the road from my Uncle Tim, who'd put down roots in Lacey after retiring from the Army at Fort Lewis. Grandma's place had towering evergreens and a little yard with bright green grass. She grew lettuces in a terracotta pot on the patio and tomatoes in the ground. It was a 3-bedroom. Grandma had her bedroom, a room for her books, and the cat's litter box, and a guest bedroom. The summer before my senior year of high school, we took a family vacation to Washington to see her place for the first time. And showing me the extra room with its made-up twin bed, Grandma told me, "This is your room." And taking this to heart, I decided to go to college in Washington. Spokane, Washington, which is on the other side of the state from Lacey, a good 7-hour drive away. So to get to Grandma's as a carless college student, I had to tag along on road trips with whoever was headed west for spring break or some long weekend. Sometimes friends of friends I'd be meeting for the first time. And they'd drop me and my backpack off at a Perkins somewhere along I-5, and there I would wait for Uncle Tim to pick me up and drop me off at Grandma's. then return me to that same rendezvous point when it was time to head back to school and hear about everyone else's road trips to Whistler, BC, or Glacier National Park, or Seattle, which were also cool, I'm sure. So were those awkward day-long road trips with random classmates a pain in my ass? Yes. And were they worth it? Always. Grandma might not have been a role model for my career aspirations, which were as constantly changing as my undergraduate major, but in her own way, her insistence on living alone on her own terms was my model for independent womanhood, and more than that, she was my model for how to keep on finding the joy in life, even after the shock of grief pulls the rug out from under you. To say my grandma had a hard life would be an understatement. She was just a child when her father died, barely in her 50s when she lost her husband to suicide, and only in her 70s when her oldest son, my father, died of cancer. Yet for as long as she lived, she was kind, generous with what little she had, and spent every day finding the joy and pleasure in her small, quiet life, solving the puzzle on Wheel of Fortune, curling up with a cat and a good book, home cooking for every meal with the occasional splurge on riblets from Applebee's, and an extra room with the bed made up, awaiting visitors. My grandma passed away in 2016, and I still miss her hugs. And I always think of her when I hear Willie Nelson's On the Road Again. Sometimes I wish I could go back in time and revisit the backseat of that Pinto in 1985. I'd love to have one more chance to put my hand on her shoulder and say, "It's okay, Grandma, keep singing. I don't care if it's off key. I think it's beautiful." Thank you.